Well, today we're in the kitchen and we are talking about everybody's favorite thing from the garden, that workhorse, squash. So today we're doing something with our green striped Cushaw squash. Now I'm actually going to leave this particular squash till later because it's huge and it's keeping really well. So it's going back downstairs. But we're going to show you another use for your squash, and it's not just for the Cushaw squash, to sort of incorporate it into your diet in a bigger way, as if squash can get any bigger. But before we do that, we're going to talk about something else for a second. We've got a little announcement, kind of a sad thing. This video will be our very last sort of in the kitchen, cooking, canning, that sort of thing, video on this channel, on our original Hickorycroft farm channel. But it's not all bad news, because we've actually started a completely separate channel, which is sort of under the umbrella of Hickorycroft Farm, where we're going to do those exact things: cooking, canning, preserving, sort of in the kitchen type stuff. So fear not, if that's the kind of content that you like watching as far as what we produce, this will be the last video here, but you can just go over there and you'll be able to see it all from in the past. We're going to move a lot of our content over, so bear with us, and going forward. So the new channel is called Pantry Living, and you'll still see our logo, the circle, Hickorycroft Farm with the barn, but we basically have done this to try to help teach the algorithm, which is not as good at figuring out what our content is as the human component. So hopefully you kind of continue to follow along on the multiple channels if you enjoy the full sort of suite of content that is Hickorycroft Farm and what we do here. But if not, and you're only interested in the cooking, canning, that sort of things, head over there to Pantry Living and yeah, check it out and bear with us as we get it up and running. So all that being said, what are we actually doing today? Well, we're making squash flour. This is something we've never actually tried before. We've done quite a bit of reading about it, and I'm kind of say it. Everybody calls it squash flour, but it's really powdered squash fruit. And what's kind of interesting about this is, if anybody's been following along with the channel for a while, you may have seen a video about making homemade fish food. And in that video, we do exactly the same thing. We basically cook various vegetables, dehydrate them, powder them, and use them as fish food. And so I've really been thinking about this a lot lately, because squash, like this, of course, is one of those vegetables. It produces so much poundage that it makes sense to turn it into something like this for addition into foods, whether it's a partial flour substitute, whether it's maybe a thickening agent using kind of similar to flour in a soup or a stew kind of thing, or whether you're just trying to get more fruits and vegetables into a dish. It's just one more thing in your arsenal to allow you to do that. So let's get right into making our powdered squash. So step one, we're starting with squash. Now, one thing that I think is a good reminder here is you could just take your squash and make massive amounts of this. But because later on we will be using a dehydrator, something that we've sort of been thinking about is when we take a squash like this, I mean, these Cushaw squash are big. We don't eat an entire Cushaw squash in a sitting, but you might cut off a neck or cut off a piece, etc. And then you're kind of left with some squash that you have to put in the fridge till later. So one thing I've actually done is taken some Cushaw squash. I don't know if you can see this very well, but I've taken it. This was in the fridge, and we're essentially taking that leftover, cutting it up into these sort of smallish pieces. You don't want them too small, and I'll explain why in a second. And the nice part about this, and I'm totally going from my experience making the fish food, is you can do it in small batches, and you can do it in small batches kind of indefinitely over the winter months, which is awesome, because then you're just going through your squash stockpile of your fruit that you basically have put down in your cold room or cellar or wherever you're storing it. You're eating what you want sort of fresh, and then you're storing the rest. So it's a real simple way to do this. What I'm going to do with this big squash is I'm going to peel it, and you don't want the skin. Now you could, as I said, you could roast the whole thing if you wanted to make a bigger batch, but what I'm going to do with it next is put it into a steamer, and my steamer is not that big, so I'm limited by how much squash I can get into this. And I'm going to say it, that's where the small batch works really nice, because this plus what I'm about to process up here should fit nicely into that steamer. So peeling squash is pretty simple, and these Cushaw squash are relatively simple to peel. So I'm going to get this ball of the squash completely peeled, and I want to get rid of sort of that green on these squash. I want to get rid of sort of this green area because that's still sort of the underlayer of the skin. Now, one little piece or tidbit here. These peels could obviously be composted, but I'm actually going to take them today and I'm going to put them into our cooked chicken food. So this is a bit of a shameless plug for essentially diverting something that would otherwise be waste to something that can be useful. And whether it's making chicken food like I'm doing today, or it's making fish food, it can also be used for that if you're keeping fish like goldfish. It's a great use for those skins. All right, well, we have our squash completely peeled, and the next step, of course, is to cut it up. As I peeled it, we made the decision to cut off a piece of this for tonight's dinner. So this squash is going really far because it's already fed us for one meal. We're going to have it for tonight, and then what's left over is also feeding the chickens, and it's going to go on to be the squash flour or the squash powder. So one thing about this too is this is a great opportunity to save some of your squash seeds. Some of these are going to become chicken feed, but we are going to put a few aside because this was a nice big squash. From a seed saving perspective and an actual gardening perspective, we have some videos on the sort of rules or things to consider when you're saving seeds from squash, but this is bringing it all full circle for next year. And we're going to get all of the innards out here so that we can then cut up the remaining flesh. Well, the squash is cut up. So the next step is to get it into the steamer. Now I'm curious, as we always are, I'm going to center this here, what the weight is before versus after, because obviously once we steam it, basically cook it, we're going to dehydrate it, and then we should lose some weight. So I'm curious to see what X volume of squash ends up being at the end.
Also curious to see how many pounds you need to make a cup of flour.
Also very true. 1,444.5 grams, so just over 3 pounds. So the next step's really easy. We're taking our squash. I've put some water in the bottom of the steamer. Really nothing to this. And the nice part of this process, you put your squash on. I'm just going to kind of rearrange them so I can get the lid on as best as possible. They will sort of mush down a little bit. Put our lid on. It's not bad. And I'm going to put this on a 4. We have basically half of that ball from that squash left. So this is probably going to go even further than just another meal. I think this is probably 2 more meals. And there's the seeds we collected. So some of these are going to be kept for replanting. But we might actually, in a totally different video, look into actually cooking these for squash seeds, because that's another value-added product you can get out of your squash. Well, we have been about 2 hours, give or take, with this steaming, and I'm pretty sure it's done. Yeah, those are, ooh, it's hot. Those are cooked. Next step, simple. We've got out the food processor, and exactly following the fish food recipe, I'm going to take this softened squash and grind it into basically a paste. Now I'll see how this kind of grinds up, as the squash tends to still retain a lot of moisture. So I may not have to add any liquid to it, which just is going to seem totally counterintuitive. I'm trying to make a nice paste, because once I get that consistency in the food processor, it's very easy to put it on to basically the trays you use in a dehydrator, which are for like fruit leathers and things. And that's going to be the final step until we get this dehydrated. There we go. Now it's not all perfectly mushed up. There is a few bigger chunks here, but for the most part, that's the consistency of like applesauce, which is perfect. So the next step is to get it onto these fruit leather trays. Now I know just from doing this in the past that I'm probably going to end up filling both of these trays from what I've pureed here. So we're just as simple as this. It's like we're making fruit leather, except it's squash. It's actually a really pretty color. And I didn't have to add any water to it. It's quite juicy in there, so we're just kind of get it out to the side. And like I say, this is exactly like making fruit leather, or in my case, fish food. So one of the reasons I do this, or suggest doing this, is essentially when we get to the grinding phase, this will be much easier to grind it into a fairly fine powder. And I'm curious on the squash side of the fence if it will keep as well as the fish food, because I've actually been finding without any real special storage containers, etc., that the fish food keeps for a very long time, and it is basically just ground up vegetables for the most part. So this will be I'll be very curious. So at this point, that beautiful yellow looking sauce, it kind of looks like, is going to go into the dehydrator, and we'll basically bring you back once it's dehydrated and show you the next step. I think that may be a day or potentially even two, depending on how quickly the moisture comes out of this, but we'll let you know how long it took. Well, we're back, and it's actually been 2 days. Now, we've left it in the dehydrator for that long. Did it really need to go that long? Questionable. There's what it looks like. So you can see it really dehydrated down. Now, we've already gone ahead and taken one of these trays off and ground it up into the sort of flour, and 3 pounds so far hasn't gone very far. We'll give you the full rundown once we actually finish this second tray. So I think one of the things that we really are thinking about with this, in terms of at least the Cushaw squash, is this may not be the best use of it for the amount of food it provides you in a sitting. I.e., you can do this, it works, but that same squash, that 3 pounds of squash, would have done another full meal, for example. That being said, if you have a year where you grow a lot of squash, or you have a point where the squash is, you're just not using what you have before it actually goes bad, and you just want to get it preserved, this still might be a viable option. And we're interested to play around with other species of squash. So to grind it, we're just using this little coffee grinder, which really works well for grinding up a lot of stuff. And we just put it through the sieve, or sift it, because as you see, we usually have to grind a couple of times to get it all ground up finally. So this is now round 2 for the second tray out of the dehydrator. And there we go, 3 pounds of green striped Cushaw squash has amounted to about a half a cup of granulated or powdered or flour-like squash material.
So since we only got a half cup of flour-like substance out of our squash, and we happen to be making a gravy type treat tonight, we're going to give this squash the ultimate test and see if it could act as a thickening agent. Now, when I make my chicken gravy, it usually has 1/3 cup of flour in order to thicken that chicken broth that we've canned previously. And we're going to see if we can do it with 1/3 cup of squash flour. I'm skeptical. We're probably going to end up needing the whole thing, but as it rehydrates, it should thicken it. This is all an experiment, and you guys are along for the ride. So my chicken gravy recipe basically calls for 1 pint jar of our homemade chicken broth. And to that, we're adding a teaspoon of soy sauce, teaspoon of onion powder, half a teaspoon of garlic powder, and a 1/4 teaspoon of thyme. So basically we're starting with 1.5 cups of broth in the pot, brought to a boil. Keep that other half cup aside, because that's what we're going to mix the, it's not really flour, I don't know, squash into to thicken it all up. So without any further ado, we're going to get our broth boiling, add all the other ingredients, and see how this goes.
Might be too thick.
Nah. Maybe, I don't know. It's probably going to be like a butternut squash soup on top of your thing. Now we're just going to stir that in and see what happens. Might have to whisk it, maybe, I don't know. Of course, the moment of truth really comes with the taste test. It definitely, I know you can't really see it and appreciate it. It did thicken it up, but definitely not like flour. It's just soup.
Our gravy's ready. The rest of the dinner is not quite ready, so I'm going to do a taste test. And it was pretty hot, so I had to cool it down. So let's see what this tastes like, since I know what the actual gravy is supposed to taste like.
When you're flipping your spoon.
It doesn't taste like the original gravy, but I actually really like it. But then I like squash. But it doesn't really have a squash flavor. The powder has quite a strong squash smell when we were grinding it. I don't know. It's actually not that bad. I'm curious to see what it tastes like on our main dinner. So one thing about this is, if I kind of show it here, it did thicken pretty good. So fairly impressed with that. I mean, that makes sense, right? We dehydrated it and then rehydrated it, which in the space of time we did this video makes no sense, but we wanted to give it a try. So there's some promise there. I think we'll see where we go with this. So there's our first experiment. Now, we are going to experiment with some of the other squash, and we have some Canada crookneck that we're going to do a video to follow this video, which is going to be over on our actual pantry living channel. So the link will be below and above, somewhere up here. So stay tuned for that, because that's going to be coming very, very soon. And I'm very curious because we used the green stripe Cushaw squash, which we both really, really love as, I'm going to say it, a dessert squash. It's very sweet and a really good substitute for what you would think of if you were using canned pumpkin for things like pumpkin pie and that sort of thing. It tastes pretty good in the gravy, although it definitely changes the flavor of the gravy from what you would expect using the flour. But I'm curious because I don't think the green stripe Cushaw squash is the best use of the flour. But spoiler alert, even though we don't necessarily find it the best use to make into this flour substitute, we have found an amazing dessert, which is coming very soon and will be on the Pantry Living channel. So stay tuned for that. So also stay tuned for watching everything cooking, canning, pantry orientated over on our sister channel or baby channel, whatever we want to call it, Pantry Living. So we will see people over there.
And hazard a guess in the comments as to how much squash Chris thinks he's going to need to grow next year.